Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the longest-serving president in U.S. history, serving 12 years in office from 1933 to 1945. He steered the nation through its worst economic crisis, only to be faced with the most horrific war in history. Though facing titanic physical challenges of his own, he imbued America with the indomitable fortitude and sense of morale that was required to spur the nation on to victory. In today's Biographics, we examine the inspirational life of the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, the only child of James and Sara Ann Delano Roosevelt in Hyde Park, New York. James recorded the event in his diary that day, writing, "At 8:45, my Sally had a splendid large boy, but was unconscious when he was born. Baby weighs 10 pounds without clothes." It was not an easy birth. In fact, both mother and baby nearly died due to the administration of too much chloroform by the doctor. Ah, good old medicine back in the day. Despite being born not breathing, Franklin went on to become a healthy child. He was raised in a privileged family, living in an impressive estate that had been in the Roosevelt family for more than a century. The Roosevelts were of Dutch extraction, having emigrated in 1654. They became an American success story due largely to development in the coal and transportation industries. Franklin's father, a Harvard Law School graduate, served as the vice president of the Delaware and Hudson Railway and also served as president for the Southern Railway Security Company. His income and his inheritance allowed him to retire to focus on his health, which had never been very good. Sara Delano was the second wife of James. Her existence revolved around caring for her son. As a result, the majority of Franklin's early childhood was spent in the company of his mother. Sara was an overly protective parent. She came to feel resentful of anyone who got too close to Franklin. Meanwhile, James was often the absent father. Young Franklin, though, he did benefit from the privileges of wealth and position. When he was 5 years old, he visited the White House with his father. President Grover Cleveland spoke to him personally, saying, "I have just one wish for you, young man, that you will never be president of the United States." Franklin didn't attend school. Instead, his father employed a private tutor for him. He was an able student who applied himself to his lessons. Each summer, Franklin and Sara would vacation at the Delano homestead in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. There would also be an annual trip to Europe. During these days, Franklin learned to speak German and French. As he grew older, Franklin became an avid sportsman. He played lawn tennis and polo and rode horses and learned to shoot a rifle. In his teens, he also took to golf and sailing. It was customary for children of privilege to attend boarding school at the age of 12. But Sara considered that her glorious boy was not yet ready to take such a big step and delayed the move for 2 years. At 14, she enrolled him at the Groton Episcopal School at Groton, Massachusetts. This school was attended by the children of the most privileged people. Although it was a shock to Franklin to suddenly be away from the protective care of his mother, he soon adjusted to dormitory life. He played a number of sports and became a member of the school debating team as well as the choir. He graduated from the school in June of 1900 with grades sufficiently impressive to secure a spot at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A Harvard man, Franklin became very socially active during his first year. He joined a number of clubs on campus and began writing for the Harvard College newspaper. He excelled in the college environment, becoming a confident and a popular student. Towards the end of 1900, Franklin's father, James, he died. A year later, another death profoundly affected him. President William McKinley was killed by an assassin's bullet, an act which propelled Franklin's distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, to the White House. This change of events served to pique Franklin's interest in his family history. He wrote a college paper titled The Roosevelts of New Amsterdam and studied the notations in the Old Dutch Family Bible. After 3 years at Harvard, Roosevelt was ready to graduate. Yet he chose to stay on for another year in order to work as the chief editor of the Harvard Crimson newspaper. One day in the summer of 1902, he was heading back to the family mansion at Hyde Park from New York when he happened upon an 18-year-old Eleanor Roosevelt. And yes, she did share his name. She was in fact a distant relative of his. The two, they hit it off immediately, and from that chance encounter, a romance blossomed. Franklin, he was captivated by Eleanor's intellectual depth and her social conscience. Things they got serious in 1903, with Franklin, who was now studying law at Columbia University, asking for Eleanor's hand in marriage. She eagerly agreed and wanted the wedding to take place as soon as possible. Franklin's mother, Sarah, was not happy with her son's choice of bride. Whether she had something specifically against the independently minded Eleanor, or she felt threatened by any woman getting between her and her beloved boy, well, that's unclear. She convinced Franklin to at least delay the wedding, which took place on March the 17th of 1905. Eleanor, who was an orphan, was given away by her uncle, and that would be President Theodore Roosevelt. The young couple honeymooned in Europe. Upon return to New York, Franklin returned to his law studies at Columbia University. In May of 1906, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, who they named Anna Eleanor. The following year, Franklin passed the New York State bar exam. He secured his first job as a law clerk at a prominent New York law firm. A second child, James, came along in December of 1907. During 1907, Franklin's mother, Sarah, had been financing the building of a double house on 65th Street in New York. It was to be a present to the couple, with her living in one house and them living in the other. The living spaces, they were separated by a single door. While grateful, Eleanor was frustrated at the way that Sarah was smothering their marriage, making decisions that should have been Eleanor's domain. This was a difficult time in Eleanor's life. Children were coming along regularly, yet she admitted that she was not a natural mother. She went so far as to write that she did not even like her children. She hired a nanny and spent more time on local New York social issues, such as working for improved factory conditions for workers. Franklin's first foray into politics, it came in 1910 when he became a delegate to the New York Democratic State Committee. He was then asked if he wanted to run for the office of State Assemblyman. It was assumed that the sitting assemblyman was about to retire. Franklin, he was enthused, but then he found out that the incumbent was not planning to retire at all. There was, though, an opening to run for New York State Senator. With no experience, but plenty of enthusiasm, he began a grassroots campaign that soon endeared him to the working people of the city. He faced an uphill battle, with the state being decidedly Republican. However, on election day, he found himself ahead by 1,000 votes, and he was suddenly the New York State Senator. The Roosevelts now rented out their house in New York City and moved to the state capital in Albany, New York. Franklin, though, he soon became embroiled in political intrigue. A powerful faction of the New York Democratic Party, known as Tammany Hall, had run the party for decades. Roosevelt, however, was not one to do what he was told. He was not going to be anybody's puppet. He stated his opposition to the Tammany Hall group and built his own support network, who were known in the papers as the Little Group of Insurgents. Through his adherence to principle and his refusal to back down, Roosevelt developed a reputation as a man who would stand up for his beliefs. As his first term drew to a close, though, Roosevelt was struck down by typhoid fever, which has a 20% death rate. He recovered, though, and vigorously campaigned for a second term as New York State Senator. He won this one by 1,700 votes. Roosevelt was a supporter of Woodrow Wilson, who won the presidency in 1912. Wilson set about rewarding those who had stood by him. In due course, Roosevelt was offered the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It was the same position that his distant cousin Theodore had held in 1897. Franklin now gave up his state Senate seat to take on the new role. Roosevelt's job had him traveling the country to inspect ships and naval yards. He soon discovered that the Navy was really quite ill prepared for war, and he campaigned for the creation of a naval reserve of 50,000 men, along with increased spending on shipbuilding. Roosevelt didn't seem to care that his words or actions were not politically expedient. His only interest, it seemed to be, in bolstering the Navy. This attitude has earned him respect across the political spectrum. With the outbreak of war in Europe in August of 1914, Roosevelt became even more dedicated to his work of building up the US Navy. He excelled in the role and won many advantages for the Navy. With the 1916 presidential election, Roosevelt's future, it hung in the balance. If Wilson was returned to office, he would no doubt retain his position as Assistant Navy Secretary, but if a Republican moved into the White House, he would more than likely be unceremoniously dumped. It was an extremely closely fought race, with Roosevelt later describing it as the most extraordinary day of my life. At the end of the day, Wilson won out to retain the presidency, and Roosevelt's job was secure. With America's entry into the war in 1917, his position took on more urgency. He was instrumental in the drive to elicit public donations for the war effort, as well as the development of mine detonation technology. The pressures of his work kept Roosevelt away from his family for increasingly long pressures of time. He began an affair with the social secretary of his wife, Eleanor, that would continue on and off until his death. The woman's name was Lucy Mercer. Sometime in around 1918, Eleanor found the letters between the two. They revealed that Franklin was planning to divorce her and make a new life with Lucy. However, Franklin's mother refused to permit such a scandal, warning her son that it would ruin his political career. From that point on, Roosevelt's marriage was one of expedience and convenience. Eleanor soon set up a separate home in Hyde Park for her and the children, and she threw herself into her social work. The break in their marriage was so severe that when Roosevelt asked Eleanor in 1942 to come back and live with him due to his poor health, she refused. In September of 1918, Roosevelt made a state visit to France and Britain to inspect naval facilities. On the return trip on board the USS Leviathan, the influenza pandemic, it ran through the ship. A number of people died and Roosevelt became very ill. However, he recovered before he reached New York. Following the end of hostilities in 1918, Roosevelt began looking towards his next run for office. After much consultation, he decided to campaign for the Democratic vice presidential nomination. His bid was successful, and he found himself on the ticket alongside Ohio Governor James Cox, who was running for president. Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary to the Navy and spent the next year and a half on the campaign trail. The 1920 election, it ended up being a resounding victory for the Republicans, with Warren G. Harding securing the presidency. Roosevelt accepted the loss with grace. He returned to New York to pick up his law practice. In August of 1921, the family were vacationing at Campobello Island when he was struck down with an illness. It was believed that he had contracted poliomyelitis, with the condition paralyzing him from the waist down. More recent analysis suggests that it may in fact have been an autoimmune disease called Guillain-Barré Syndrome. Sarah urged her son to retire and live out his life in retirement. But his closest advisors, including wife Eleanor, they felt otherwise. He should continue with his public career, which they assured him was on a trajectory towards the White House. Thus encouraged, he spent the next few years in physical rehabilitation. If he couldn't walk unaided, he would at least project that impression to the public. He taught himself to walk a few paces with metal braces on his hips and with the aid of a cane. He was determined that the public would not see him in a wheelchair. In 1926, Roosevelt financed the building of a hydrotherapy debilitation clinic in Warm Springs, Georgia. He spent much of his time there throughout the remainder of the 1920s. During his rehab years, Roosevelt maintained close contact with the Democratic Party. Then in 1928, he reluctantly ran for governor of New York. He won by a margin of just 1%. His governorship was marked by a focus on innovative infrastructure projects such as hydrostatic power plants and the institution of his fireside chats, during which he spoke directly over the radio to the people of New York. Winning re-election in 1930, Roosevelt introduced an economic relief package to help the millions suffering from the side effects of the Depression. He also established a number of commissions to root out public corruption. As the popular two-term governor of the country's most dynamic state, Roosevelt was a front-runner for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1932. He won the nomination at the Democratic National Convention. In his acceptance speech, he promised, "I pledge you, I pledge myself, to a new deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign. This is a call to arms." Roosevelt ran on a platform of government-funded public works, farm relief, and the repeal of prohibition. On the strength of these policies and his winning personality, he won 57% of the popular vote to become the 32nd President of the United States. After taking the oath of office, Roosevelt delivered his inaugural address, best known for its famous line,
"So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance."
After the inaugural address, a woman by the name of Sarah Love said, "Any man who can talk like that in times like these is worthy of every ounce of support a true American has." Roosevelt assumed office in the midst of the greatest financial crisis that the United States has ever faced. Unemployment, it was at 25%. Banks had closed all over the country, and more than 2 million people were homeless. Roosevelt dedicated himself to saving the nation. He would do so by putting in place the relief programs of his first New Deal. He restructured systems that were broken, and this invigorated the spirit of his people. Another key to this invigoration were his fireside chats, which were something he continued from his governorship. He spoke to the American people as a loving father, full of optimism and of good ideas. During his first term, Roosevelt established a number of major relief initiatives. These included the Federal Relief Administration and the Public Works Administration, which provided employment to 250,000 men throughout the country. In August 1935, he also signed the Social Security Act, which included benefits for the unemployed and the elderly. From 1935, Roosevelt embarked on his second New Deal, squarely focused on the business community. Wholesale changes were made to the banking industry and business in order to make things fairer to the everyday man. By 1936, Roosevelt's policies and personality had made him one of the most popular presidents in all of history. The election that year, it was a landslide victory, with the president taking every state except Maine and Vermont. During his second term, Roosevelt spent a lot of time embroiled in legal challenges to many of the programs that he had brought in during his first term. In 1936, the Supreme Court was largely conservative. However, by 1941, Roosevelt had appointed 7 of the 9 justices. With growing tension between Germany and the other European nations, Roosevelt pursued a policy of U.S. isolationism. However, by mid-1938, with public opinion in the U.S. firmly against German aggression towards the Jews, he began building up the military for the possibility of war. When the war broke out in September of 1939, he actively looked for opportunities to support Britain and France. Roosevelt struck up a great friendship with Winston Churchill, who became British Prime Minister in May of 1940. The United States, it began supplying an increasing number of armaments to the British, while at the same time continuing to build up its own war footing. The fall of France, after just 6 weeks, it was a shock to everyone in America. From that point forward, the majority of people, they were inclined towards American intervention in the European war. In 1940, Roosevelt made the decision to run for an unprecedented third term as president. There had been a tradition of limiting presidents to 2 terms. However, Roosevelt was convinced that a change of leadership in a time of approaching war would be disastrous for the country. Throwing himself into the campaign, he won another overwhelming victory, winning 85% of the popular vote and 38 of 48 states. Throughout 1941, Roosevelt became overtly critical of Hitler. He became furious when Hitler began threatening American shipping in the Atlantic, declaring, "We will not let Hitler prescribe the waters of the world on which our ships may travel. The American flag is not going to be driven from the seas either by his submarines, his airplanes, or his threats." Then, on December 7th, 1941, more than 350 Japanese fighter planes launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Some 3,000 people lost their lives. Dozens of ships were sunk, and many planes were destroyed as they just sat on the runway. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress with these memorable words. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He then asked Congress to declare war on the Empire of Japan, which it duly did. Within days, the declaration of war was extended to include Germany and Italy. Franklin Roosevelt, he was now a wartime president. As the U.S. war machine rolled into action with hundreds of thousands of men being sent to Europe and the Pacific theaters of war, Roosevelt focused on building up morale on the home front. His main vehicle for achieving this was still his fireside chats. On February the 23rd, 1942, he told the nation,
"Here are 3 high purposes for every American. 1, we shall not stop work for a single day. If any dispute arises, we shall keep on working while the dispute is solved by mediation or conciliation or arbitration until the war is won. 2, we shall not demand special gains or special privileges or special advantages for any one group or occupation. 3, we shall give up conveniences and modify the routine of our lives if our country asks us to do so. We will do it cheerfully, remembering that the common enemy seeks to destroy every home and every freedom in every part of our land."
With the Americans having just entered the war, the Russians won a decisive victory in the Battle of Stalingrad. The Nazis, they were finally being pushed back towards Berlin from the east. Roosevelt and his generals, they were convinced that a similar push from the west would drive the Nazis into submission. The planning for a grand invasion of Western Europe had begun. Throughout 1942 and 43, Roosevelt had a number of other meetings with Allied leaders, including Churchill, Stalin, and the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek. On June 5, 1944, President Roosevelt addressed the American people with the following news. Yesterday, on June 4, 1944, Rome fell to American and Allied troops. The first of the Axis capitals is now in our hands. 1 up and 2 to go. The following day, a major step was taken in taking out the biggest Axis power. On the morning of June 6, 1944, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. After fierce fighting, the German army it was pushed back. Now the Nazis, they were being squeezed from both sides. It was now clear to Roosevelt that an Allied victory was coming. He began to place his focus on the logistics of that victory. He spoke of the Allies as a group of united nations. He was convinced that only a worldwide union of nations could prevent a future war. Roosevelt's championing of what was to become the United Nations finally brought Woodrow Wilson's dream to life. Wilson's dream had been the imperfect League of Nations. But as we all know, the United Nations is still around today. With the 1944 presidential election rapidly approaching, Roosevelt said he felt torn, stating, "All that is within me cries out to go back to my home on the Hudson River, to avoid public responsibilities, and to avoid also the publicity which in our democracy follows every step of the nation's chief executive. Such would be my choice." But we of this generation chance to live in a day and an hour when our nation has been attacked, and when its future existence and the future existence of our chosen method of government are at stake. Roosevelt ran for a 4th term, but he did not involve himself in the campaign. Still, he won again. He was now set to serve out 16 years as the President of the United States, but it wasn't to be. The stresses of the war had taken a heavy toll on Roosevelt. He was now 62 years old. He looked weary, suffered from high blood pressure and a weak heart. During the summer of 1944, he came down with a bad cold. He was still sick when he traveled by ship in February 1945 to Malta for the Big Three conference with Churchill and Stalin. Roosevelt was exhausted when he arrived back in Washington on February the 28th. People commented that he looked like he was dying, and they weren't far wrong. All Roosevelt wanted to do now was sleep. At the beginning of April, he managed to escape Washington for his retreat at Warm Springs, Georgia. On the morning of April the 12th, he sat while an artist painted his portrait. They stopped for lunch at 1 p.m. 15 minutes later, he complained that he had a terrible headache. Then he slumped to the ground. He was experiencing a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He died at 3:35 p.m. on the 12th day of April, 1945. It was just 27 days before the war in Europe came to an end. Having guided his country through its worst depression and its most harrowing war, F.D.R. was finally at peace. Historians, they consistently rank Roosevelt, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln as the 3 greatest presidents. F.D.R. biographer Gene Edward Smith wrote of Roosevelt, "He lifted himself from a wheelchair to lift the nation from its knees." So I really hope you found that video inspiring. I think it's the right word for that. I rather enjoyed that one. If you did like it, please do give us a thumbs up below. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you want more videos from us, and hit that bell so you actually find out when we put out new videos. We do a few a week, so do that. You'll find out about them. And as always, thank you for watching.